May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Last week we were reminded that to build a life of discipleship, we must acknowledge and firmly believe that even if we're in a stage of unbelief, whatever stage we're in, no matter what, God still believes in us. God still believes in us. And today we hear that we are endowed with unique gifts given by God, utilized for discipleship. But what could that mean? Well, Socrates, who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living," would be proud to know that we're asking the question of ourselves, why am I here? Why am I here? Good question. And to answer it requires one to consider many things: our passions, our gifts that we've been given, our hopes, our fears, our desires. We need to ask ourselves, are we interested in even connecting with others? Or would we like to leave a legacy for this world? What is happiness to me? Am I after power and wealth? Or could it be that upon my examination of my own faith, am I destined for discipleship in some way where God can use me for the kingdom? Well, some of you may remember on Christmas Eve, our very own children of the parish reflected on this very question: why am I here? I was very impressed with that. And in asking it, our children modeled that even at a young age, we long to understand our gifts, our identity, our purpose in this world. I can only imagine that immediately after St. Matthew, for instance, left his tax ledger, or the sons of thunder left their fishing boats, they probably asked, "Why are we here? Who is this Jesus?" They couldn't see into the future, what was to happen. But what turned their lack of vision into a journey of clarity certainly had to be some of the miracles that they witnessed, but also stories. Jesus' stories. We call them parables. Parables. Jesus told lots of parables. And his parables were meant to draw in his crowd, to draw in the disciples, to draw them in with something familiar that was very common to them, and then boom, arrest them with something, wow, new, something different, a new truth. His parables, in a way, turned sort of a mirror onto themselves, revealing who they were through those stories. And they were faithful. They were faithful disciples. So Jesus must have believed in the power that stories possess, because he used them so often. And whether stories are nonfiction or saga or mythology or even just something in between, stories do have a way of helping us kind of see ourselves in this world, see ourselves more clearly. But sharing our stories is another thing. sharing our stories sometimes requires courage, because sometimes our stories are shameful. Sometimes they may be painful. Some chapters of our life may have addictions or abuse. Some chapters are unwritten. Sometimes we have stories and chapters that seem like they have no purpose at all. So to share your story isn't so easy after all. And on the other side of the coin, listening to stories demands something of us, an active listening ear, but it might take some patience and some empathy, compassion for the person, and sometimes that's hard to do. But our stories reveal that we have so much more in common with our neighbors, so much more than at first glance, so much more than upon our first judgment of that person. And our stories can become invitations to new friendships. And isn't that a goal? Shouldn't that be a goal of new friendships? Fellowship in the Lord, to be a good disciple? In the Greek, it's known as koinonia. A good disciple seeks out koinonia, communion with others, community, commonness. So whether the stories that are upon us that come at us from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, or from a Stephen King thriller, or from the gospel accounts, doesn't matter. All stories have the power to transform. I like to take some of the master storytellers and think about their impact on my life. Southern writers like Tennessee Williams or Walker Percy or Harper Lee adeptly wove our Southern quirkiness, sometimes our violent dramas here in the South, and transform them into lasting stories that live on, stories that capture our imagination. They tap into our threads, our stories. And you know that I'm a classic movie lover. I like the black and whites. And so there's that classic movie, It's a Wonderful Life. We watch it at least 2 times a year because I need a booster shot in the summertime, because of the story is incredible. I always have a hanky at the end. But halfway into the movie, our protagonist, George Bailey, is feeling as insignificant as ever. He's about to jump off a bridge into a freezing river. But the angel Clarence, who's trying to earn his wings, it's only taken him like 300 years. He shows up to answer George's prayer, to learn, why am I here? What is my purpose? And it's clever what he comes up with. Clarence replays the story of Bedford Falls, right? Excising, omitting George from the story. So he got to see Bedford Falls' story replayed without him in it. And man, Bedford Falls looked a lot different. And he was able to see a first-hand account of his life, that his ordinary life was quite remarkable. In a way, this story, this movie reminds me of our gospel lesson today in the wedding in Cana where the wine runs out. Because running out of wine at a wedding feast, it's bad enough if you're an Episcopalian, but if you run out of wine at a wedding feast in Palestine, it would be very embarrassing, even shameful. It could ruin your reputation. So in other words, the host of this wedding feast was in crisis. In a way, he was sort of standing on that same bridge next to George Bailey. But Jesus stepped in, kind of like Clarence. And he transformed 6 stone jars of water into wine, the very best wine. And isn't that how Jesus works? Jesus is always taking something that's lacking, something that might be insignificant, something that's maybe being oppressed in society, and makes it abundant, makes it worthy, makes it overflow. For instance, women in biblical times, in a patriarchal world, to Jesus, he made them of high integrity. He gave them value. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Fed 5,000 and had leftovers. Frightened disciples hiding in the upper room became the apostolic foundation of the church. We could go on with stories like this. Disciples can be the balm of an infected, sinful world. And Clarence, the angel, he knew this, and he was desperate to convince George that his good heart had made a difference in the world, in his town of Bedford Falls. And he says to him in that memorable scene in the cemetery, he says, "Strange, isn't it? Each man's life touches so many other lives. When he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole." How often do we find ourselves in a hole, sinking, where we perhaps are forgetting that no matter our story, no matter where we are in our faith journey, God still believes in us. How many times must God prove God's love? My goodness, God is love. God's love created and continues to create everything that we see, every encounter. Love is everywhere. We just have to open our eyes. One time, a priest friend of mine officiated a wedding where the new couple wanted to write down their own vows. That can be scary. The bride's words were beautiful. They were poetic. It was all about eternal love and heartfelt, you know. The groom, he gave his vows and then nudged his best man and said, "And I promise to share the remote control." He got a few laughs, I guess, but perhaps that groom was onto something. Perhaps that groom unknowingly sort of backed into a deeper truth. That love can grow. Even in the unassuming gestures that marry 2 stories, merging their ordinary rhythms of daily life into one beautiful story. Love shows up. It shows up even when we're so generous that we'll share the remote control. These stories, the wedding feast, George Bailey, and sharing the remote, all prove that God takes whatever we offer, even a widow's mite will do. Because discipleship isn't about waiting for the perfect moment. Discipleship isn't about achieving some lofty standard of holiness. No, disciples have faith that God will transform their life, even their doubts, even their insignificant feelings, and transform them into something holy and something life-giving. So I recount those children of our parish on Christmas Eve out of the mouths of babes. in witnessing our children on Christmas Eve asking, "Why am I here?" Man, that was cool. Because we see our children writing the introductions to their discipleship journeys. How about you? Why are you here? Tell us your story. These questions are not just for curious children. Discipleship has been and always will be our calling to serve God and one another as much as it was for the original 12 disciples. If we can remember that God still believes in us, no matter what, our true life of discipleship will take off with authenticity and in reflection and in the willingness to offer our stories and ourselves to God and one another, no matter how insignificant they may seem, by asking ourselves, why am I here? We're invited to recognize the sacredness of our stories, embrace our unique role of discipleship in God's plan, and trust that with God's help, we possess extraordinary potential for God. And ultimately, we will witness that our best life, like the best wine, is yet to come. Amen.